I would like to personally thank all of you for coming. This is the biggest fundraiser so far that CCDL has done. We reached out to a number of the manufacturers in the Northeast, and all of you were extremely generous to help support our cause, which is raising the profile for our litigation effort to overturn the laws that were passed in Connecticut last year. We are going to have a live gun auction later in the evening after Ambassador Bolton speaks, so I trust you'll stick around for that. We've got some beautiful firearms. I would like to offer a special thanks to Ambassador Bolton in particular for making the trip all the way up here. The real thanks in particular goes to you. This effort would not be possible if it weren't for the generosity of everyone sitting in this room. So I'd like to move on to our keynote speaker, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton has been fighting for freedom and conservative principles throughout his entire adult life and professional and government career. He's a native of Baltimore, Maryland, who obviously is having very similar issues to Connecticut with regards to bad gun legislation. Ambassador Bolton attended Yale University and graduated from Yale Law School in 1974, so he has been fortunate enough to spend a good amount of time in Connecticut. His work in government began in 1981 under the Reagan administration. Over the following 2 decades, Ambassador Bolton worked in a variety of posts under the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, and as you all know, was finally appointed to be UN ambassador in 2005 by George W. Bush. Ambassador Bolton is currently Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and, as we all know, a regular contributor on Fox News. He's involved in a number of conservative think tanks and policy institutes and is on the National Rifle Association Board of Directors as Chairman of the International Affairs Subcommittee. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Bob, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And as you said, really thanks to everybody who's here. I was born and raised in Maryland, and I spent 7 years in Connecticut, so there must be something I'm doing wrong in a sense politically. But I know how tough a state this is, and the circumstances that you faced in the legislature up in Hartford. But it is critical that even when you look around and it's a tough state politically, that you don't give up and to fight the fight politically and where necessary to fight it through litigation. And I think it may be a long road. I think your case is going to end up in the Supreme Court. It certainly deserves to. May take a while. Maybe by then we'll have a president who can affect the Supreme Court, make the outcome a little bit more, make it a little bit more certain that we'll get a congenial outcome. But nonetheless, this really is a struggle, as Bob said, not just about Second Amendment rights, although that's obviously our focus. It is about the larger picture of whether we run the government or the government runs us. So if that struggle's not worth fighting about, then I really don't know what is. And I'm glad to be back in Connecticut. I did spend 7 wonderful years in New Haven. Depending on how you look at it, in some perspective, Yale's a little bit of an alien environment in the larger Connecticut framework, but it's a great part of the state. I was fortunate enough to have in my law school class and has been a good friend for a long time, Clarence Thomas. I couldn't be happier that he's on the Supreme Court. You know, he's a very athletic guy. He does an amazing amount of work to keep himself in shape because he's determined to be there for a very long time, and good for him. Now, on the other side, a year ahead of me in law school were Bill and Hillary Clinton. So I feel like I've been burdened with them for 20 years longer than the rest of the country. But we could probably survive them as well. I wanted to talk a little bit, though, about tonight about the current environment in Washington, primarily on the international front, with the prospect of what we're going to see for the next 2+ years, and talk some about the implications of the remainder of President Obama's term for international efforts at gun control, and then also some of the critical national security issues that we face as a country and that you can see on television and in your newspapers now every day. And I think that although the question of protecting Second Amendment freedoms and international security issues may seem a little detached from one another, I think they're really very closely connected. And I think they're particularly connected given the worldview of President Obama, who is, I think, clearly the most radical president we've had in history, both on domestic matters and internationally. And this is really how they tie together. The Obama worldview is very, very different from the view that really every American president since Franklin Roosevelt, Republican or Democrat, has held. And it's a combination of factors, some ideological, some based on his own experience, but they shape a view of the world that is unique. He's not the first leader of his party to hold these views, but he is the first to be elected president, and therefore this is quite significant. And I think the predominant aspect, the predominant factor that shapes the president's view of America's role in the world is that he just doesn't care about American national security. Now that may sound counterintuitive, but in fact the president told us in the 2008 campaign that his priority was to fundamentally transform America. That's what he said. Those were his words. And in his mind, these international developments just keep getting in the way. So he confronts problems that occur around the world really only when he has no alternative, when he's put in a context where he simply cannot avoid dealing with them. And he turns away from them as soon as he can. That really is what the phrase leading from behind means. And it's not just disinterest in international affairs. This is the second factor where his ideology comes into play, is that the president really views America as part of the problem internationally, that our posture in the world these last 70 years almost since the end of World War II has been too assertive, too strong, too dominant, and really too successful. So that his view is that if you had a less intrusive, less assertive America, that the world would actually be a more peaceful place because people would not be reacting against us. Now, I happen to think this is like looking at the world through the wrong end of a telescope. It's precisely America's strength in the world, our system of alliances since World War II, that has provided whatever limited measure of peace and stability there's been in the world. Now, there's precious little stability in the world, to be sure, but if America performs a less significant function, then there are only two possibilities. Either what limited stability there is disintegrates and you move back toward a more anarchic world, or other powers step in to advance their own interest. And you can bet that those interests will not coincide with ours. And we can see would-be medium and larger size powers that are already doing this in several areas around the world. The president is not troubled by this. Because he thinks it's our strength that's provocative. And so if we're less strong and less visible, there'll be less provocation. But it's American weakness that's provocative. And we've seen examples of that all around the world, some of which I'll talk about tonight. But this is really where the next factor comes in, and where the issue of international gun control, I think, emerges. It's not that the president is isolationist in the sense of that we think of isolationism from the 1930s or even the 1940s, where it's just not paying attention at all to anything that happens internationally. The president thinks that the way to protect what interest we do have internationally is through multilateral organizations, that our security and our place in the world are really protected by organizations like the United Nations. And this is an almost religious, a theological view of what these organizations do, of what role the UN and international treaties can play in providing peace and security around the world. As I say, he's not the first person to hold these views. If you look at what George H.W. Bush said in 1988 when he received the Republican nomination for the presidency running against Michael Dukakis, Bush then said, "My opponent thinks of America as just another pleasant country on the United Nations roll call somewhere out there between Albania and Zimbabwe." And that's exactly the way the president views it. Is we have our interest, but so does everybody else in the UN. And like a good community organizer, you sit down at the table with everybody and you work out your differences. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. Now that's just not the way that an American president should behave. It's not that we don't respect the interests of other countries around the world, but he's not their president. He's our president, and he's supposed to protect our interest. I think Obama really, though, sees his role as something very different. And this is the final aspect that comes in to help establish his worldview. I don't think the president believes in American exceptionalism. Now, this is a somewhat controversial subject for our friends in foreign countries, because some listen to the phrase American exceptionalism and they assume that we mean superiority, when in fact what we really mean is exceptionalism, that we had a different historical experience than other countries, and it's something that really has shaped us for several centuries. But the president, when he was in Europe on his first trip overseas in 2009, was asked by a British reporter if he believed in American exceptionalism, and his answer was very revealing. He said, "Yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, just as the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism." Now, let's parse that sentence. In the first third, he says, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, so by inference, all of these people who say I don't are wrong. I just told you what I believe in. But look at the second two-thirds of the sentence where he takes it all back. There are 193 countries in the UN. He could have extended that sentence, just as the Papua New Guineans believe in Papua New Guinean exceptionalism, just as the Burkina Fasosians believe in Burkina Faso exceptionalism. I mean, you see the point. If 193 nations are exceptional, if everybody is, then nobody is. And that's really what he's talking about. And Obama has said this in contexts that people largely don't pay attention to, like his speeches at the United Nations, but are very revealing of this combination of factors that gives you the worldview that controls his policy. In 2009, he said, "It is my deeply held belief that the interests of nations and peoples are shared. No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will ever succeed. No balance of power among nations will hold." Now, I thought about those statements for a long time, and I particularly thought about the one where he says, "No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed." And I wondered, who was he talking about? And then, of course, it hit me. He's talking about us. He's talking about us. He's talking about subordinating the United States to the collective judgment, in this case, of the membership of the United Nations. And that is really scary. And this is how it fits into international efforts at gun control and the Arms Trade Treaty that was recently negotiated at the United Nations. This is the perfect example, from Obama's point of view, of the ideal foreign policy. And it's something that actually we see in a number of substantive areas that we normally consider domestic policy, but which are increasingly played out in the international environment. And it's another important example why protecting Second Amendment rights is a surrogate for broader battles, because these issues, taking domestic subjects of domestic political debate and internationalizing them, is a tactic that people on the left in America and Europe have resorted to increasingly. And in this country in particular, they're not satisfied with the results they get in Congress or at the state or local level. So they'd much rather negotiate international treaties and conventions where they're more likely to get what they want. And it applies in a wide variety of areas. The death penalty. Now, you can be for the death penalty or against the death penalty. But what I think we should agree on is we decide in the United States whether we're going to have the death penalty or not. We have a public debate, the state and federal level. Ultimately, our representatives vote, and we get presumably what the majority wants. Questions like abortion, a very controversial subject, but one that can be resolved through public debate. You can like the outcome or not, but we decided here, not through international treaties. The environment, an important issue to many Americans. I think we believe that we should debate issues of the environment in Washington at the state and local levels. Obama would prefer to go to Copenhagen and negotiate with the Europeans and China and India for an international treaty to govern issues like climate change. And gun control is, as I say, really one of the best examples. But it's as I think I've just shown, this is part of a much bigger picture where, unsatisfied with our constitutional system, I mean, forgive us for being proud of it, they just don't get the result they want, so they're trying to change the terms of the debate. And that's what they've been trying to do on arms control. And that's what this Arms Trade Treaty is a first step toward. Now, this treaty is not what the gun control advocates wanted when they started 20 years ago. When I came into the George W. Bush administration in 2001, my first job was Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And I was visited by friends from the NRA shortly after I arrived at the State Department in the late spring of 2001, and they said, we got a big problem coming up at the UN in the fall. Because for years, international gun control groups have been drafting a treaty that they're going to try and put through under the guise of trying to stop illicit international trafficking in what they euphemistically called small arms and light weapons. And these negotiations have been proceeding. We're lucky that they didn't reach a conclusion before the 2000 election, but they weren't fast enough. And now, with Bush in the White House rather than Al Gore, there's a chance to stop it. But the momentum was unbelievable toward trying to sign something then. And while the argument was there are a lot of illicit deals in arms with shady arms dealers from the former Soviet Union, the notion that we needed a treaty to deal with that problem was completely backwards. As many of you probably know from the firearms manufacturers, the United States has the most comprehensive, some would say excessively burdensome, system of export controls for weapons manufacturing of any country in the world. It's extraordinarily difficult to get a license to export something under the Arms Export Control Act. I think it's a system that certainly can be refined, but I have no trouble in saying we far surpass any country on earth in making sure that our international arms sales are responsible. We don't need a treaty to make us do what we're already doing. But that wasn't the point of the negotiations anyway. The real point was getting an international agreement that would impose obligations on countries that signed up to it to strengthen their domestic gun control legislation. And we basically decided, the President was entirely on board with our strategy, that we just weren't going to accept it. Now, this was before the Heller decision, but I didn't have any trouble going to New York in 2001 and saying, let me be clear here, the United States is not going to accept any international convention or treaty that, if it were enacted as positive law in the United States, violated our Constitution. We're just not going to accept a treaty that we wouldn't accept as law. And it was as if I'd said something really offensive to people, that we thought the Constitution might mean something in international negotiations. And I'm proud to say that the delegation that went up there, with a lot of help from NRA and other groups, basically brought the entire process to a screeching halt. There was no arms trade treaty. The whole thing was derailed. But because these groups play a long game, they've come back. And they came back over a decade and a half and continued their negotiation to get what has now been approved up in New York. As I said a moment ago, this is not what they wanted, but it is a first step. And, you know, they've put out a lot of disinformation about what it covers and what it doesn't cover. They say that the treaty recognizes that there's a legitimate right for the private ownership of firearms. We should really be grateful for that, I assume. But the fact is, it doesn't accept that. It merely acknowledges that some countries hold that view, and that language is in the preamble of the treaty. And as international lawyers will tell you, preambles don't mean anything. So it's a completely meaningless gesture, a form of words that has no impact. And in the treaty itself is language which, while not what the gun control groups wanted, gives them the hook that they need. It requires accounting and monitoring of gun production and sales within countries so that they can fulfill their international obligations to limit the sales of small arms and light weapons. So this is the paradigm that some of the leftist groups use. If they could get the Senate to ratify the treaty, which admittedly it takes 2/3 rather than a simple majority, but you don't need the House of Representatives. Isn't that convenient? And if they can convince senators not to really read and think about the treaty, you know, not hard to do in days when they pass bills like Obamacare that nobody reads, and if they could, they couldn't understand them. They get the treaty ratified, and then they say, guess what? This provision and that provision require that the United States do X, Y, and Z in its domestic legislation. This is the pattern that they want to use to force the United States to conform to their international standards. And that is entirely consistent with Barack Obama's view. If he can't get what he wants, he'd love to have international treaties that, quote unquote, force him to do it. And remember what he said, what he has said repeatedly in the last several months, that he's got a pen and a phone that he'll try and do with executive orders what he can't get Congress to do. Now, he has signed this arms trade treaty, and those of us who enjoy reading the Constitution know that it doesn't come into effect. It's not binding on us until the Senate ratifies it. But there's another international treaty out there called the Vienna Convention on Conventions that says when you sign a treaty, even if you haven't ratified it, you are precluded from taking any actions that impair the obligations and the objectives of the treaty. So that in effect, you're held to the terms of the treaty before you've had a chance to ratify it. Now, I should point out, we haven't ratified that treaty either, although the State Department acts as though we have. And it's a convention, look, it may make sense for parliamentary systems, where when a prime minister signs something, he knows he's got a majority in Parliament, he's probably going to get it through. It's not a provision that makes any sense for a constitutional system like ours with a system of separated powers. Quite apart from the fact, as I said, we haven't even ratified the treaty. But I will guarantee you, once we get past November, that the President will say, having signed the arms trade treaty, I'm now precluded from doing anything that would defeat its objectives and purposes, and therefore I'm going to start signing executive orders that in effect try to implement provisions of the treaty, at least as far as it affects what the federal government can do. Honestly, I would have predicted that Obama would have taken this route much earlier in his presidency. I think one reason he didn't before was he was waiting for the 2012 election, and now he's waiting for the election in 2014. But after this November, it's Katie bar the door. We have effectively no constraints on him other than what Congress can stop him from doing or what we can stop him from doing in the courts. And I think that you will see, again, not just in the area of Second Amendment rights, but in a wide variety of substantive areas, the President will try and impose his will as much as he can before he leaves office. This is essentially the only reason that he worries about these international dealings, because of their effect on our domestic environment. And it's something, honestly, that many Americans are simply not aware of. We think, we hold to the quaint notion that we live within a constitutional system and we make our own decisions. That's not their view. I call them the international high-minded, because after all, they know better than we do, and if we're not able to follow their suggestions domestically, they'll find a way for us to follow them internationally. And I think this is something that reveals fundamentally what the President's basic ideology is he's just not concerned with the uniqueness, the exceptionalism of America. He wants us to be more like the rest of the world, and God help us if that's what happens. I think we can see that, again, just by looking at the newspapers and television, because this approach that he has followed of America not taking a leadership role in the world, not because we're trying to benefit other countries, we do this for ourselves, to protect our own way of life here at home. You can see that internationally the strength of the American position is declining, and the anarchy that I mentioned a few moments ago is spreading, whether it's in Eastern and Central Europe, as we can see in Ukraine, as it's throughout the Middle East and North Africa, or increasingly in Asia. The President simply doesn't seem to appreciate or doesn't seem to care that when you have a regime like Putin in Russia that is using military force to change international boundaries on the continent of Europe and meeting effectively no opposition whatever, it creates conditions of risk and instability that affect not just the Ukraine or countries in their immediate neighborhood, but it sends signals all around the world that America's in retreat, and that this is an opportunity for adversaries of ours to advance their interest. Now, specifically on the Ukraine, George Bush in April of 2008 made a proposal to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on a very specific path. The Europeans backed away, and 4 months later, the Russians invaded Georgia. What did Barack Obama do at the time? He called on both Russia and Georgia to exercise restraint. I mean, I'm sure that really made them smile in Moscow. They saw right then what Obama was made of. They didn't need to hear that off-mic conversation in 2012 between Obama and President Medvedev of Russia, where Obama says, tell Vladimir after the election I'll be able to be more flexible. They already knew what was coming, and they've seen it now. Why has Putin continued this policy of aggression? The answer is because he thinks he can get away with it. And so far he has. Even after suffering significant political setbacks in Ukraine, he's still using military force in the eastern part of the country. And while I don't think there's any doubt that the shooting down of this Malaysian Airlines plane was a mistake, a mistake that you can't directly trace back to Moscow. By creating this kind of environment, by using this kind of military force, maybe this precise tragedy wasn't predictable, but something like it certainly was. So this is a huge test for the United States, and it's not just with respect to what happens in Ukraine. Nobody's watching Ukraine more than China. China has made assertive, aggressive territorial claims over the East and South China Sea. They want to make the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. You say, but that really doesn't affect us. That's a long way away. Let me tell you, every barrel of oil that comes from the Middle East to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the countries of Southeast Asia, goes through the South China Sea. If China takes that sea and makes it into a Chinese lake, they've got their hands around the throats of some of America's major trading partners. And they understand it out there, even if Obama doesn't. But obviously, it's the Middle East that's the biggest zone of chaos at the moment. And so, by the way, when Obama says he wanted to pivot from the Middle East to Asia, which he hasn't done, why? He was pivoting away because our policies there have been so successful. This is a major zone of instability and danger for the United States. And it's not just Iran's nuclear weapons program, although that's certainly something to be gravely concerned about. Iran with nuclear weapons, combined with the fact that for 35 years Iran has been the central banker of international terrorism, and you have a terrorist threat that makes what we saw on the first 9/11 pale in insignificance. You know, after the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, we had no hesitation, and we're quite right, to overthrow Taliban and try and dismember al-Qaeda. But think just for a second, what would we have done if the Taliban had nuclear weapons? That's where Iran will be very shortly. And given its financing and arming of terrorists around the world, once they get a capability to retaliate with nuclear weapons, it's not just a threat to Israel, although it is, it's a threat to the whole world, which is why our unsuccessful efforts these last almost 15 years to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons are so dangerous. But it's obviously well beyond that, too. You've seen much of the Middle East descend into chaos in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and threatening in Iraq today, threatening other countries all around the region, where we've got important allies, not just Israel, but the oil-producing monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, that have become extraordinarily vulnerable to this rising tide of terrorism. If you listen to Obama and Vice President Biden, they said in 2012 Osama bin Laden is dead and al-Qaeda is on the road to defeat. And yet just a few months ago, General Clapper, Obama's own Director of National Intelligence, testified in an open session of Congress that the terrorist threat today was at least equal to what it was right before 9/11. And the risk today is much higher that the terrorist will gain access to weapons of mass destruction, if not nuclear, then biological and chemical. We just saw in the Gaza Strip, Hamas flying a drone over Israel, shot down by the Israeli Defense Forces. But the threat that poses is not simply of drones with rockets, and obviously it came from Iran. Hamas didn't build that in a local machine shop. They got it from Iran, which is where they get most of their sophisticated missiles. The drone capability that I have feared for many years is the capability to spray biological and chemical weapons over an urban area. And by flying that drone over Israel, they demonstrated at least that they've got step one of that capability in line. The fact is that the terrorists, the state sponsors of terrorism, are reading our government today the same way the Russians and the Chinese are. We're weak and we're inattentive. And the worst example of that, obviously, was the attack on the consulate in Benghazi on September the 11th, 2012. Now, Secretary Clinton can say, as she did, what difference at this point does it make? This is a huge issue. It's not just the failure to anticipate the risk before September the 11th, 2012. It's not just the failure to do anything about it when the attack took place. It's the failure to do anything meaningful about it in the nearly year and a half since the attack itself. We've arrested one person, and it's not even clear he's necessarily a ringleader. But following the Obama administration's law enforcement approach to terrorism, as opposed to treating it for what it is, a war against the United States, we've brought this guy to Washington, and we're going to put him on trial in what will probably turn out to be a circus, as he uses it for a propaganda demonstration. But the lesson that the terrorists and the state sponsors draw from American inaction for a year and a half, no retribution, no retaliation, no effective steps, is what it means to commit terrorism in the time of Barack Obama. You know, an American ambassador overseas is the president's personal representative. That's what it says in your instruction letter. And everybody knows that. When you drive around a foreign capital, the American ambassador has our flag on the right fender of his car. Everybody knows where he or she's going. And so the lesson that the terrorists learned from Benghazi is you can kill the personal representative of the President of the United States and get away with it scot-free. You can assassinate Obama's representative in Libya and do it with impunity. That is a terrible and frightening lesson about the decline in American power, and it's one that the whole world has seen. So I like to say I bring sweetness and light wherever I go. We've got 2+ years of this to go, but here's what's encouraging. Really, it's people like you. It's our duty as citizens to stand up for the kind of government we want. And thank God we still have that ability in this country. And if enough of us stand up, we will change the kind of government we have. And I think there are plenty of other Americans out there who are ready to join us. So the work that you all are doing here in Connecticut on these Second Amendment issues and more broadly is absolutely critical. It's not anything to be discouraged about because you're not in a clear majority here. It's an example to people all around the country. So again, I just want to say I'm honored to be here with you tonight, and good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Ambassador, for making the trip up. We've all really enjoyed your presentation. We wanted to give you something that, even though your 7 years in New Haven were probably some of the most memorable of your life, we wanted to make sure that you wouldn't forget Connecticut. And I understand that you're somewhat of a history buff, not surprisingly. So we have found an item that I think you can probably use in Washington at some point.
Oh my goodness.
This is a officer's general staff sword that was actually presented to a Lieutenant William W. Warner in 1874 by a small group called the Hilliard Guard. Most swords aren't inscribed. The Hilliard Guard was a post-Civil War unit of the Connecticut National Guard. So we would like to present you with this saber, and hopefully you can use this to slice through the red tape in Washington or anything else that you find. Subscribe here. Oh, and also we also have a commemorating the presentation of the sword. There's an article from a Hartford newspaper called The Knapsack, printed in July of 1874, that you can have with it as well.
That's great.
Documenting the event.
Thank you.